So this is the second part of the second lesson of a course on the science of political economy based on Henry George's book of the same name. I cleverly neglected to record the second part of the session live at the Henry George School. So I'm just going to go through my notes and cover that material. So after the break in the class, I pulled up a graphic of a sailing ship, and I said this to the class. George's use of a sailing ship, both talking about how it is sailed and how it's built, is a brilliant example, a good example of his brilliant use of an example well chosen to both develop his thought and to convey his thinking. In the case of the sailing of a ship, this is a demonstration of one type of cooperation because unlike the dichotomy we looked at before the break, there is another way that George looks at cooperation. He sees two kinds of cooperation. One, cooperation by conscious direction from one or more individuals, directing others who are working with them on the one hand, and then what he calls unconscious or spontaneous cooperation. So as an example of the first kind, he uses the sailing of a ship. I'd like to read you an excerpt from his book on that point. He writes, "A beautiful instance of cooperation of the first kind is furnished by the tacking of a square-rigged ship under full sail. The noble vessel, bending gracefully to the breeze, under her cloud of canvas, comes driving along, cleaving white furrows at her bow and leaving a yeasty wake at her stern. Suddenly her jibs fly free, and her spanker flattens as she curves towards the wind. Her foreyards round in, and their sails begin to shake, and at length, as what were their weather braces are hauled taut to fill on the other side. The after sails that at first held the wind as before, begin in their turn to spill, then their yards are shifted, and they too take the wind on a different side, and with every sheet and tack in its new place, the vessel, gathering again her deadened headway, begins to drive the foam from her bow as she bends on the other side to cut her way in a new direction. So harmonious are all her movements, so seemingly instinct with life, that the savage who sees for the first time such a vessel beating along the coast might take her for a great bird, changing its direction with the movement of its wings as do seagull and albatross. But in the ship the motions of the parts are produced by the distinct action of a number of conscious wills, ranging from 1 or 2 dozen in a merchant vessel to several hundred in an old-fashioned ship of war. Their cooperation is produced not instinctively and unconsciously, but by intelligent obedience to the intelligent orders of one directing will, which prescribes to every man his place and function, directing when, how, and by whom each motion shall be made. The bird veers because when it wills to veer, nerve and tendon directly respond with the necessary motions. The ship tacks because the separate wills that manage her rudder and sails consciously obey the successive commands which prescribe each of the necessary motions, from the first order, full for stays, to the last, belay all. A series of intelligent directions, consciously obeyed by those to whom they are addressed, bring about and correlate the movements of the parts. Nor could the maneuvers of a ship be carried on without such intelligent direction. Any attempt to substitute independent action, no matter how willing, for responsive obedience to intelligent direction, would be certain ere long to result as in the traditional coasting schooner manned by 2, captain and mate, where the captain who was steering, irritated by some gratuitous advice of the mate, who was tending jib sheets, yelled out to him, "You run your end of this schooner and I'll run mine," whereupon there was a rattle of chain at the bow and the mate yelled back, "Captain, I've anchored my end of this schooner. You can run your end where you choose." By way of contrast, George talks about the building of a ship, and this he gives as a very good illustration of the unconscious or spontaneous method of cooperation. Bear with me, because let's settle in. This is a fairly lengthy reading, but I think one that is worthwhile picking this up from just after the previous section I read. Now, George says, much of the cooperation of man in producing social effects is of the nature of that by which a ship is sailed. It involves the delegation to individuals of the power of arranging and directing what others shall do, thus securing for the general action the advantages of one managing and correlating intelligence. But while cooperation of this kind is indispensable to producing certain results by conjoined action, it is helpless or all but helpless to bring about certain other results involving a longer series and more complicated and delicate actions and adjustments. As the savage would understand the kind of cooperation called into play in the managing of a vessel, so would he attribute the building of the vessel to cooperation of the same kind, since a larger canoe than one man can build may be built by the same man if he can unite the exertions of others in cutting, rolling, hewing, and hollowing a great log. So it would seem to our savage that it was in this way that the ship of civilization was built. And the admiration which the ship would excite in him would be an admiration of the men who sailed it, whom he would naturally take to be the men who built it, or at least to be the men who could build it. The superiority of the ship to the rude canoes with which he was familiar he would attribute to superiority of their personal qualities, their greater knowledge and skill and power. They would indeed seem to him at first as very gods. Yet the savage would be wrong. The superiority of the ship does not indicate the superiority of individual men. If driven ashore with the loss of their ship and all its contents, these men would be more helpless than so many of his own people and would find it more difficult to make even a canoe. Even if they had saved tools and stores, it would be only after long toil that they could succeed in building some rude, small craft unfitted for a long voyage and rough weather, and not in any respect comparable with their ship. For a modern ship is rather a growth than a direct construction, in that as between the kind of cooperation required for its production and that which suffices for that of a canoe, there is a difference which suggests something not altogether unlike the difference between a work of nature and a work of man. The cooperation required in the making of a large canoe or in the sailing of a ship is exceedingly simple as compared to that involved in the construction and equipment of a well-found first-class ship. The actual putting together, according to the plans of the naval architect, of the separate parts and materials which compose such a ship would require, after they had been assembled, some directed cooperation. But if cooperation of this kind could suffice for even putting the parts together after they had been made and assembled, how could it suffice for making those various parts from the forms in which nature offers their material and assembling them in the place where they were to be put together? Consider the timbers, the planks, the spars, the iron and steel of various kinds and forms, the copper, the brass, the bolts, screws, spikes, chains, the ropes of steel and hemp and cotton, the canvas of various textures, the blocks and winches and windlasses, the pumps, the boats, the sextants, the chronometers, the spyglasses and patent logs, the barometers and thermometers, charts, nautical almanacs, rockets and colored lights, food, clothing, tools, medicines, and furniture, and all the various things which it would be tiresome fully to specify, that go to the construction and furnishing of a first-class sailing ship of modern type, to say nothing of the still greater complexity of the first-class steamer. Directed cooperation never did, and I do not think in the nature of things it ever could, make and assemble such a variety of products, involving, as many of them do, the use of costly machinery and consummate skill, and the existence of subsidiary products and processes. When a shipbuilder receives an order for such a ship as this, he does not send men into the forest, some to cut oak, others to cut yellow pine, others to cut white pine, others to cut hickory, and others still to cut ash and lignum vitae. He does not direct some to mine iron ore, and others copper ore, and others lead ore, and others still to dig the coal with which these ores are to be smelted, and the fire clay for the smelting vessels, some to plant hemp, and some to plant cotton, and others to breed silkworms, some to make glass, others to kill beasts for their hides and tallow, some to get pitch and rosin, oil, paint, paper, felt, and mercury. Nor does he attempt to direct the manifold operations by which these raw materials are to be brought into the required forms and combinations, and assembled in the place where the ship is to be built. Such a task would transcend the wisdom and power of a Solomon. What he does is to avail himself of the resources of a high civilization, for without that he would be helpless, and to make use for his purpose of the unconscious cooperation by which, without his direction or any general direction, the efforts of many men working in many different places and in occupations which cover almost the whole field of a minutely diversified industry, each animated solely by the effort to obtain the satisfaction of his personal desires in what to him is the easiest way, have brought together the materials and productions needed for the putting together of such a ship. He buys various dealers in such things, knees, beams, planking, spars, sails, cables, ropes, boats, lanterns, flags, nautical instruments, pumps, stoves. And he probably contracts for various parts of the work of putting together the hull, such as caulking, sheathing, painting, etc., of making the sails and rigging the spars. And each of these separate branches of collation and production will be found on inquiry to reach out and ramify into other branches having necessary relations with still other branches. So far from any lifetime sufficing to acquire or any single brain being able to hold the varied knowledge that goes to the building and equipping of a modern sailing ship, already becoming antiquated by the still more complex steamer, I doubt if the best informed man on such subjects, even though he took a 12-month to study up, could give even the names of the various separate divisions of labor involved. A modern ship, like a modern railway, is a product of modern civilization, of that correlation of individual efforts in which what we call civilization essentially consists, of that unconscious cooperation which does not come by personal direction, as it were from without, but grows, as it were, from within by the relation of the efforts of individuals, each seeking the satisfaction of individual desires. A mere master of men, though he might command the services of millions, could not make such a ship unless in a civilization prepared for it. A pharaoh that built pyramids, a Genghis Khan who raised mounds of skulls, an Alexander, a Caesar, or even a Henry VIII could not do it. So, having read that to the class, I then asked people to consider what other objects of wealth may be found in the classroom could be examples of things that had to have a developed civilization behind them in order to be produced. And a couple of people naturally sort of pointed to the laptop computers in the class, including mine. And one person, in fact, held up a cell phone, which I thought was a good example. So I pointed out that even the plastic that goes into the cell phone, let alone the circuit boards and such, it required a fair amount of development of society to be able to exist. And we, noticed that plastic is a sort of petroleum byproduct, so the plastic would require the digging of oil wells and the extraction of oil, and then the sort of refining of the oil to make plastic. And I also pointed out that it was unlikely that anybody in the room, despite the very large variety of backgrounds and industries that people had worked in, would be able to even work the petroleum up into the plastic needed just for the plastic part of a cell phone. So then I went on to say that George also in this book uses analogy brilliantly, another way that he develops and conveys thought on the science of political economy. In this case, he analogizes the two different kinds of cooperation, two different aspects of functions in the body and processes. He likens direct, cooperation under direct, direction, conscious direction, to the movement of the voluntary muscles in the body that you have the will and desire, sort of command your muscles to move, and you can grab an object or do other muscular work of that type. Whereas unconscious or spontaneous cooperation he likens to the involuntary processes that in many ways are needed to allow your body to function, such as the circulation of the blood or the regulation of the digestion and that kind of thing. And I read the class rather a nice quote on that. Again, a nice sort of concrete language where George discusses that point. He says, Aristotle, Julius Caesar, Shakespeare, Newton may be fairly taken as examples of high water mark in the powers of the human mind. Could any of them have the control of the processes that maintain the individual organism been relegated to his conscious intelligence, have kept life in his body a single minute? Newton, so the tradition runs, stopped his tobacco bowl with his lady's finger. What would have become of Newton's heart if the ordering of its beats had been devolved on Newton's mind? So he makes the point further that this kind of explains the flaw in socialism, in a sense. He says elsewhere that the only thing that conscious direction can do to aid unconscious cooperation is to let it alone, to give it freedom to grow, leaving men free to seek the gratification of their own desires in the ways that to them seem best. To attempt to apply that kind of cooperation, which requires direction from without, to the work proper for that kind of cooperation, which requires direction from within, is like asking the carpenter who can build a chicken house to build a chicken also. And then he observes, this is the fatal defect of all forms of socialism, the reason of the fact which all observation shows, that any attempt to carry conscious regulation and direction beyond the narrow sphere of social life in which it is necessary inevitably works injury, hindering even what it is intended to help. I mentioned this sort of delicately because I think that a number of students may be enamored of the ideas of socialism. And I did point out that the famine within recent times in North Korea might be considered an example of what George is talking about, considering that South Korea, right nearby, didn't experience that kind of thing, and that the famine in North Korea seems to have been at least partly caused by defects in that society's attempts to regulate all kinds of production of wealth. I also, though, mentioned that on the other side of the political spectrum, those who might consider themselves as so-called capitalists or free market economist types have, there's a difference between their thinking and George's, and those people with that kind of ideas about economics sometimes attempt to claim that George is in support of their views, but in fact, this is a misconception. He's not an apologist for that point of view, first of all, George would be likely to point out that capitalism, as it's used today as a term, is itself sort of inherently fraught with error, because capital, as it's discussed, to the extent it is discussed by the economists of George's day, as well as economists today, is not defined at all, or is badly defined in the sense that it's inconsistently defined, and is also subject to the flaw that many economic writers consider capital and land to overlap as categories, to land to be a form of capital, which George does not feel is correct. And also, George, as far as the laissez-faire theory, free market sort of theory, George points out that even in his day, that was a distortion of the original concept, that even the phrase laissez-faire is foreshortened, the original phrase being laissez-faire, laissez-aller, not just let industry go about its business, but also let it go about freely. He translates it, he thinks that the equivalent English phrase would be a fair field and no favor. George is hostile in many parts of his writings to trusts, rings, cartels, influence peddling, corruption, the ways of the robber barons. I think this is nicely illustrated in a quote from Social Problems, another one of his books, in chapter 5, which is entitled The Wrong in Existing Social Conditions. There, George says, on page 69, that he who produces should have, that he who saves should enjoy, is consistent with human reason and with the natural order. But existing inequalities of wealth cannot be justified on this ground. As a matter of fact, how many great fortunes can be truthfully said to have been fairly earned? How many of them represent wealth produced by their possessors, or those from whom their present possessors derived them? Did there not go to the formation of all of them something more than superior industry and skill? Such qualities may give the first start, but when fortunes begin to roll up into millions, there will always be found some element of monopoly, some appropriation of wealth produced by others. Often there is a total absence of superior industry, skill, or self-denial, and merely better luck or greater unscrupulousness. So finally, I introduced George's idea on the subject of the production of wealth, at least for this lesson, that man is the only exchanging animal. And I read a quote that I'll read now from The Science of Political Economy on that point. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Where he says, after having talked about the animals, other than human beings, and the role that instinct plays in their ability to survive in nature, he says, now of this power or impulse that we call instinct, conscious man has little. While the voluntary and unconscious functions of his bodily frame may be ordered and maintained by it or something akin to it, and while it may in the same way furnish the substratum of what we may call his mental frame, yet instinct, so strong in the orders of life below him, seems with man to fade and withdraw as the higher power of reason assumes control. What of instinct he retains would not suffice even for such social constructions as those of ants or bees or beavers. But reason, which in him has superseded instinct, brings a new and seemingly illimitable power of uniting and correlating individual efforts by enabling and disposing him to exchange with his fellows. The act of exchange is that of deliberately parting with one thing for the purpose and as a means of getting another thing. It is an act that involves foresight, calculation, judgment, qualities in which reason differs from instinct. All living things that we know of cooperate in some kind and to some degree. So far as we can see, nothing that lives can live in and for itself alone. But man is the only one who cooperates by exchanging, and he may be distinguished from all the numberless tribes that will with him tenant the earth as the exchanging animal. Of them all, he is the only one who seeks to obtain one thing by giving another. A dog may prefer a big bone to a little bone, and where it cannot hold on to both, may keep one in preference to the other. But no dog or other animal will deliberately and voluntarily give up one desirable thing for another desirable thing. When between two desired things the question which is put to it, its answer is always the answer of the child, both, until it is forced to leave the one in order to hold the other. No other animal uses bait to attract its prey, and here I suggested George might be wrong about that, but his basic point I think is still a good one. He goes on, no other animal plants edible seeds that it may gather the produce. No other animal gives another what it itself would like to have in order to receive in return what it likes better. But such acts come naturally to man with his maturity and are of his distinguishing principle. Exchange is the great agency by which what I have called the spontaneous or unconscious cooperation of men in the production of wealth is brought about, and economic units are welded into that social organism which is the greater Leviathan. And here the use of the term Leviathan is a reference to Hobbes's term where he terms the social organization as a kind of Leviathan. So at this point, I basically concluded this second lesson, and I said I would save for the next lesson more of a discussion of how George debunks the Malthusian theory that population naturally tends to make it harder and harder as it grows for people to produce wealth, and also how George debunks the wages fund theory. And we'll talk about that in the next lesson. And we'll also talk about George's thoughts on the distribution of wealth at that time. One other thing I covered in this second lesson, earlier on in the lesson, was a discussion of how exchange, being part of production, is in a large way what accounts for the great amount of value of land to be found in the heart of great cities, because it's there that people are in close enough proximity to each other that they can readily exchange products and ideas. And this is exchange being an important part, as George observes, to the production of wealth. This is what makes land rent at such much higher prices in the heart of great cities as compared to in more sparsely populated areas. So that's where I will end it for the second lesson, and we'll cover the other points I mentioned in the next lesson.